Climate change has happened ever since the Earth first had an atmosphere. The climate has been changing, and it's actually pretty difficult to unpick which elements of climate change would have happened anyway. And so if that's what people want to do, then fine. But at the moment, the approach that's been taken is to impose that onto the public rather than to gain their consent for it. Our priority is to industrialise, and we want to use gas to do it. That is our route to prosperity. The government does not run the country. And until people understand that, you're not going to get change.
Welcome to the Reform Party podcast. Now, today's guest is a very special guest who I've been super excited to have on the podcast. She's Kathryn Porter. She's the founder of What Logic and an independent energy consultant with deep experience in electricity, gas and oil markets. If we look back at Kathryn's career, it spans top-tier finance and energy firms from Barclays Capital and EDF Trading to Société Générale and Centrica, where she's designed award-winning transactions and helped clients navigate everything from market entry to complex commodity derivatives. With a master's in physics and an MBA from London Business School, she brings rare analytical clarity to the often opaque world of energy markets. So today I am delighted and thrilled to welcome Kathryn Porter. Hi, Kathryn.
Hi. You make me sound really good in that intro.
You are very impressive. You're a very impressive woman. I first saw you live at the Reform conference this year at the Energy Panel. And I felt at the time these debates that we're having about energy and energy policy and energy provision are absolutely critical. And so I thought I'd love to have you on the podcast. And I'm very grateful that you're here because it enables me to ask you some questions about as a consultant, independent consultant who isn't tied to any particular agenda, to pick your brains about what you see happening in the UK right now, where we're headed and what you think are some of the answers. So let's start on that topic. Let's do a deep dive straight in.
And I think it is worth mentioning that I am independent. I get criticised quite a lot on social media for being funded by oil companies, and it's actually not true. I'm not funded by oil companies or anyone else. I have no external funding at all. I earn income from consulting work, and that's it. Nobody gives me money for any other reason. And I'm definitely not paid to put out anything that I don't believe in. So if I'm asked to write a report, if I'm commissioned to write a report, then obviously we agree the topic of the report, and it'll be like prospects for nuclear in the UK. And that's the extent of the input of the person commissioning the report, whether that's a think tank or a company. And that's it. So it's, but people assume that because I'm not following certain sort of lines and agendas, that I'm being funded by oil companies and all the rest of it. And it's just not the case.
I think that's really important to get that out there because absolutely people, I think there's a lot of misinformation, disinformation and publicity that people bring to bear on their own particular areas of expertise. And as you say, you're not funded externally from anybody. You are an entrepreneur running your own business. And so your views are your own and exactly. Nobody else's.
Exactly. And I'm not affiliated with any organisation. I'm not part of any political party. I'm not part of any sort of single interest industry groups. I'm on the executive council for the All Party Parliamentary Group for Energy Studies. But the only thing we lobby for is good information. We don't have any specific agenda. Obviously, people within the group have agendas. You've got some people who are very pro-hydrogen, some people who are very against hydrogen. But the group as a whole would lobby for the government to make a decision on hydrogen, not to lobby for a specific decision. And so I'm not part of any group that's pushing any individual agenda here. And if there's too much of people trying to play the man and not the ball in this arena at the moment. They don't like what you have to say, and therefore it's all about who's funding you and what's your agenda and all the rest of it, rather than the underlying data, which is what I want to talk about. And, when you were asking about the risks we're facing to the power system, I think we have some really significant risks that are being underplayed. And there are no really easy answers to this either. This is what really concerns me, is that we're facing some very significant risks to our legacy infrastructure and there is no plan, there's no investment plan, there's no money, there's no timetable, there's nothing to remedy it. So if we look at gas-fired power stations, for example, we absolutely rely on gas-fired power stations. We've never run the power grid without using gas since the 1990s, when we first started building gas power stations. And particularly when it's not windy or sunny. And in the winter, the peak of demand every day happens at nighttime. It happens after the sun has set. So there's zero solar in the winter peaks. And sometimes there's no wind. We've got 32 gigawatts of installed capacity, and it's not unusual to have less than 1 gigawatt actually delivering. And so when that happens, we rely on gas. Now, and we rely on gas all the time, but the extent to which we have to use gas obviously depends on how much wind there is in the winter. A third of our gas power stations were actually built in the 1990s. They pretty much date back to the start of us using gas. And these assets, although they did, most of them have some major refurbishment work done in the early 2000s that would extend their asset lives. They're pretty much at that point now where they're starting to enter the retirement phase. They're getting to that 30-year lifetime, which is when you'd expect them to start retiring. And so you either need to replace them or you need to do another major overhaul and upgrade. Now, if you want to order a new gas turbine right now, the waiting time to get that equipment delivered is between 7 and 8 years. If you want a new rotor, it's about 5 years. And even the components for significant maintenance is about 1.5 years. So this is like, so you've got a third of your gas fleet could retire in the next 5 years, and you can't replace it in 5 years. Mm. Then we've got almost all of our nuclear power stations also going to retire over the same period. Just under 5 gigawatts of nuclear is set to close by 2030. And Hinkley Point that's going to be just over 3 gigawatts, and that's not going to open until 2031, 2032, probably. I mean, EDF is still saying that the first unit will come in 2029, but nobody really believes that. So we're potentially going to lose 15 gigawatts of capacity. Now, that's about a third of our winter demand, and there's no plan for replacing it. Now, that's the generation issue. Then we have a similar issue on the power grid, where there was a big spike of investment in the 1970s. Half our power lines, a third of our transformers, and 30% of switch gear were built in the 1970s. So power lines, they last quite a long time, so they're not really an issue. But the transformers and the switch gear, yes, they are. And guess what? We don't really have a plan to replace those either. And, Ofgem and the network companies have really been prioritizing grid expansion for connecting renewables. And therefore, because of cost of living concerns, they don't also want to give money for asset replacements. Now, Ofgem will say, we've never declined money for necessary work, but then they complain that the business plans aren't very good and all the rest of it. So there's a pretty dysfunctional relationship happening now between the network companies and Ofgem. And the result of that is that we have this risk that we actually don't do the work that we need to do. And not wanting to point fingers in any given direction, I think what Ofgem needs to think about is less about, how good are these business plans, and more about, do we think these assets are getting old and at risk of expiry, and therefore do we need to intervene to make sure that they're replaced in a timely fashion and not be so passive? Because if you look at the water sector, Ofwat was extremely passive. It was signing off inadequate business plans just to keep costs down, and it knew they were inadequate. So if you don't invest on an ongoing basis in asset renewal on your networks, then eventually you're going to have to do a big catch up. And we see that in the water sector now. The only real route to doing that is putting up bills. So, and you don't really want to be in a situation where you have to put up bills by a large amount all of a sudden because all of this work has become critical. You want to spread it out over time so it has less of an adverse impact on bill payers. And so in the power sector, the question is then, should we stop connecting renewables, particularly when we're connecting stuff that we can't necessarily use? And should we prioritize making sure the grid that we do have is going to keep working properly?
Okay, so what we have is that's a great explanation, and I love the fact you've just dived straight in, Kathryn. I didn't have to say anything.
Well, you did ask me a
Wonderful.
question about risks, so
I did. Now, so we have if you might call them legacy and legacy energy providers. We have an infrastructure. We have Ofgem. We have many other parts of that mechanism, if you like, that deliver energy to our homes and businesses and across the UK. And historically, of course, we have been reasonably self-sufficient, not entirely self-sufficient, but we have often seen that as an absolute priority that needs to be addressed and needs to be invested in. However, that is, of course, one element of the whole debate. We also then have the net zero question and carbon and climate, which has also, in the last 10 to 15 years, become a lot more prevalent in people's minds and has become the focus of attention. And as you rightly say, we've got the legacy question to ask, but now we have layered upon that an additional challenge, which is that we want to go net zero by 2050. So I'd like to hear from you about how plausible you think those plans and ideas and vision is, and where the risks are now that we've also layered upon that additional challenge as a nation.
Right, so I've never thought that net zero 2050 was feasible, and I've actually never thought it was desirable either. And it's too absolute, actually, and it relies on technologies that don't exist. So there's a huge amount of hopium in there, where you're like, oh, we hope this new technology will develop, or because we're going to have this rule that says we have to do X and Y, then technologies will emerge that will do that. But that's just not necessarily the case. And even where technologies can emerge, it can take them a very long time to develop. So I started my banking career working in the technology and telecoms sector during the dot-com years. And so this was like the late 90s, early 2000s. And we were talking back then about using your mobile phones to pay for things. And yet that really still isn't mainstream. More people don't use mobile phones to pay for things than do. And it's only really been in the last handful of years, maybe 5 or so years, that it's even become significant in any way. So it took basically 20 years to get to even a level of scale, and it's not the main way that people pay for stuff, and it probably won't become the main way that people pay for stuff for some years, if ever, in fact, because I personally don't want to use my mobile phone to pay for things, because I don't want to have all my eggs in one basket. If my phone breaks or gets lost or stolen, then how am I going to buy things, So, there are good reasons why people wouldn't want to go down that road. So that, of course, so if we look at the very long time for this technology, it had been identified. Yes. You kind of had all the bits in place to deliver it, but yet it still took 20 years to get over the line. And
actually, the way that we now use our mobile phones to pay for things is a very different technology than was envisaged 20 years ago, because credit card systems have changed, regulation has changed, coding has changed, the development of mobile phones themselves have changed. Apps, for example, 20 years ago there was no such thing as an app on a mobile phone, or maybe it was in the mind of Apple at the time, but it was really through Apple that we started to have apps. So you're absolutely right that what was envisaged in terms of how it might work or how we might utilize it 20 years ago, nowadays it's taken on an entirely different form. Even if we might use that lump of metal as a mechanism of payment, but it's not how it was originally designed to be.
And in fact, we are just using when we're using mobile pay, really, the phone is acting as an alternative to a credit card. It's basically behaving in the same way as a credit card. So it's just a phone-shaped credit card instead of a credit card-shaped credit card. But nevertheless, it was 20 years, really, from when we started talking about that back in the late 90s, early 2000s, in the dot-com years. And there was an awful lot of nonsense talked in those years as well. I mean, one of the reasons that bubble burst was because people had this mistaken idea that the digital economy was going to be additive to the conventional economy rather than replacing it. So people were like, oh yeah, people will buy books on Amazon and they'll buy books in Barnes and Noble and Waterstones and so on. And you're like, no, they won't. They're not likely to buy extra books. They're going to still probably buy the same number of books. They just might buy them in a different way. Yes. So yeah, I mean, So the technology evolution, it does happen, but it doesn't necessarily happen on the timescale that you expect. And some technology evolutions that you do expect just don't happen at all. And some you decide that you actually don't want as you go through time. You think, oh, actually, maybe that wasn't such a great idea. And that would, say, interfere with privacy too much or whatever. So I don't believe that net zero is feasible in 2050. And I don't believe it's desirable, because I actually think it will be too expensive. And that maybe the net zero, so to try and get 100% of your emissions either removed or offset through negative emissions, is, I think, it's too absolute. And if you think about something like the power sector, and they've always said, oh, again, we're going to have 100% net zero in the power sector, or we might even go for a negative emissions power sector by using biomass with carbon capture. And I have big issues with the way the carbon accounting works for that anyway, but let's say for the sake of argument it was legitimate. You still don't, there's still going to be elements of it that is probably never going to be cost effective to decarbonize. If you were still going to need to use some gas generation on the coldest days of the year, for example, and these units were only going to run, I don't know, 10 days a year, trying to decarbonize them would cost a ridiculous amount of money per megawatt hour, per unit of generation. The cost of decarbonizing that would be insane. But the amount of emissions that they would create over the period that they run would not in any way justify spending that money.
Yes.
So our whole mindset around this is too absolute, and it's too divorced from what's really likely to be achievable in the time frame. And I think there are two other concerns I have with it. One is that there's a lack of public consent, that we've never had a debate about how we're going about this. The public's been fed a line that it's going to be cheap and easy. We're going to have renewable generation, wind and solar, and they're going to be super cheap because the wind and the sun are free. This is a massive lie that's been told to people, because yes, the wind and the sun are free, but the machines that you need to take that free energy and turn it into electricity, they're definitely not free. They're quite expensive, and they're never going to be cheap. This is the thing. We started subsidizing wind in 1990. So it's already 35 years. This is now a mature technology. And they say, oh, yes, these technologies are not mature, blah, blah, blah. Right, we started building gas power stations in the 1990s as well, but we didn't subsidize those. And they were brand new, because up until the mid-90s, up until the late 80s, early 90s, I can't remember exactly when, but the EU actually banned the use of gas for electricity generation. So that technology was developed, and actually, Britain started building its first gas power stations in anticipation of the EU repealing that rule, because we found gas in the North Sea, our coal supplies were declining, and actually across Europe, they were recognizing that they would prefer to use gas than coal. So we sort of jumped the gun a bit. But this is the same time frame that we started subsidizing renewables. So this argument, oh, your gas power stations, they've been around so much longer, they're so much more mature, well, it's just not true. Mm-hmm. And so you've got this misconception that renewables prices will continue to fall because the market's developing. Well, no, it's developed, right? After 35 years, it's developed. And this is what we see. If you look at the capital and operating costs of wind farms, they did fall until the mid 2010s, and then they stagnated and started to go up. And now the costs really are likely to reflect wider trends within the economy. So raw materials costs, energy costs, just like the costs of many other goods that you can buy. There's not going to be that overriding driver of the experience curve anymore, because this is a mature industry. So this is a lie that's really been sold to the public. And so now you're starting to see this pivot from the green lobby, which is more along the lines of, yes, okay, maybe it's not so cheap after all, but the climate emergency means that we can't, there's no other option. We have to do it. Okay, well, that is a legitimate argument to make, but it's one that voters have to consent to. Voters have to agree to spend more money on energy in order to protect the climate. And, so if that's what people want to do, then fine. But at the moment, the approach that's been taken is to impose that onto the public rather than to gain their consent for it. And it's been imposed alongside a lot of false and misleading and untrue information to try and sort of fudge this issue of consent. And so we need to be much more open and honest. And if the public wants to go along with it, then fine. I'm also not here to to do the same thing and say, oh, well, this is in the best interest of people. I think people need to make their own choices about that. But it has to be done on the basis of correct information. So we've got this democratic deficit when it comes to net zero. And, people say, oh, yeah, the polls show that the public's very supportive of environmental, responsibility and so on. And this is true, right? But then on the one hand, you say, well, how do you really expect people to say otherwise? If a polling company comes up to you and says, do you care about the planet? What sort of a psychopath is going to say no? So there's always that inherent bias there, that people are unlikely to be genuinely truthful. But then when you follow up and say, well, how much are you willing to spend on these climate measures? They say something like £10 a year, some like ludicrously low amount of money that really wouldn't achieve anything. And I think that's where you see their true feelings about it, which is they're actually really not willing to make those sacrifices. So this issue of democratic consent is really important. And then I think the other factor here is that there's never been a debate around prevention versus adaptation. The assumption has been that we have to try to prevent climate change rather than that we should try and just adapt to climate change. And climate change is presented now as being something that's only caused by human activity, which is not correct. Climate change has happened ever since the Earth first had an atmosphere. The climate has been changing. And it's actually pretty difficult to unpick which elements of climate change would have happened anyway. But it is a fact that even if there were 0 human beings on the planet and there'd been 0 industrialization, there would still have been climate change. And if you look through human history, you've had migration of populations because of environmental factors. Floods and so on have required people to move from their one homeland to another. And somehow now in the modern age, we think we are somehow immune to that. And maybe that's an incorrect assumption. Maybe we should just say, yeah, some low-lying islands are going to flood. They would have flooded anyway. And the best thing to do is just simply to move the people somewhere else.
And actually, this is where, of course, cheap
for them, but it's
and cheap energy in those situations is the key driver to enabling better technology to be able to effectively protect those people in the long run, because cheap energy means you have more innovation. It drives an economy. It allows people to experiment. It allows people to try new things because their energy is cheap. When it gets expensive, of course, we see what happens to an economy, as we're currently seeing, of course, in the UK, that energy policy is and in Europe, absolutely, we're having a massive downward pressure on innovation and growth. And again, the governments across Europe may want to help us to look at it in a different way, and keep trying to persuade us that, oh, your energy bills are going to come down. But as you say, those subsidies have never come down. They're just going to go up.
Yeah. And just coming back to this question of consent as well, when they talk about the climate emergency, and they always talk about the people who will be harmed by climate change, but they don't talk about the people being harmed by the efforts to prevent climate change. So wind and solar energy is very low energy density. That means you need an awful lot of stuff. You've got to dig a lot of stuff out of the ground, a lot of rock out of the ground that you then have to crush up, use chemicals on energy, process it in order to gain the metals and the minerals that you need to build all of these wind turbines and solar farms. And, so you see environments in Africa and South America being damaged by this. You look at something like lithium production in South America, where they're doing it for electric cars and for grid scale batteries. There are disputes over access to water because it's taking water away from agriculture and human consumption. In Chile, which is a huge source of copper, and you need an awful lot of copper for all of these transition technologies, the soil there is very rich in arsenic. So when you open a new mine, you're blasting all this arsenic into the air, and obviously then people breathe it, it falls on the crops, it goes in the water, poisons the fish, all this stuff. And there's higher instances of cancer in those areas as a result of that. So you're poisoning people in South America in order to save some people in the Indian Ocean from their islands flooding, when in fact those islands might flood anyway. And then you have even people affected by, or that you might expect would be affected by climate change in Africa. That's not their priority. Now, I was at a conference a few weeks ago with a large number of delegates from Africa, and their message was incredibly clear. They said, we do not see a climate emergency. We have a poverty emergency. Our priority is to industrialize, and we want to use gas to do it. That is our route to prosperity. And, maybe decarbonization is something that we can think about down the line. But right now, our priority is to industrialize. So, but you've got, people in the West saying, oh, no, you can't, you've got bankers trying to decline funding for projects because they don't want to support fossil fuels, without really accepting that the alternatives might be worse. So I've seen funding decline to projects that would provide LPG as an alternative to using dried dung for cooking. And that's obviously, that creates a lot of indoor pollution. It's very with lots of detrimental health impacts, and it's pretty gross as well, really. And yet they can't get onto liquefied petroleum gases, which are much cleaner, because some virtue signaler on Wall Street says, oh no, we don't want to fund fossil fuels. And so they're then condemned to this worse, dirtier solution instead. So there's an awful lot of people in Western countries, and particularly now in Europe, but Canada and Australia and New Zealand as well are in the same boat, and until recently the US, dictating both to their own publics and to other people around the world. They're dictating that we've got to do net zero. We've decided, our opinion, our completely non-expert opinion is that this is what has to be done because we think there's a climate emergency, and we think this is the only answer to that climate emergency, and you have to lump it. And that has effectively been the message that governments have been delivering both to their own people and to other people.
Now, without turning into a conspiracy theorist, why do you think that is, Kathryn?
I think that throughout history, we've seen lots of people making weird decisions and behaviors for reasons that now we look back on and think are completely nuts, but at the time people believed with great sincerity. So if you take the Reformation, for example, and the persecution on either side of Catholics or Protestants, people held this view that if you didn't follow the true faith, then you would burn in hell for eternity. Now, if you believe that that is going to happen, you can justify going to just about any lengths to get other people to follow what you think is the true faith. And that will include torturing them, to death in gruesome ways. And this is in fact what happened. People were tortured to death in very gruesome ways during the 15th and 16th century. And this was, they were holding these very sincere beliefs. They were, okay, I mean, obviously you're always going to have some people who are just corrupt and trying to hang on to power and all the rest of it. But a lot of people involved in this, and a lot of the general public, they weren't rising up and saying, no, this is stupid and ridiculous, and how, insane is it that you're, torturing people in these disgusting ways, to prevent their souls from going to hell. They also believed in that. And so,
do you think it's partly a Marxist agenda whereby those governments want to control the population? They want to stop this idea of self-sufficiency, particularly when it comes to energy?
I don't really buy that, because I don't think Marxists are, or any other political philosophical group, if you like, are actually that effective. And, I don't think the Conservatives were Marxists and they were buying into the whole net zero thing. So no, I don't think that. I mean, I think obviously there are some people who are Marxists who believe in net zero, but I don't think it's a big conspiracy. They're just not that organized, to be honest. I mean, do we really think Marxists are that organized? I don't. I mean, I don't think any group is that organized. You know, when I hear people talking about the Jewish conspiracy to control the media, I'm like, seriously, do me a favor. If they're having this global conspiracy to control the media, why is the media so negative about Jewish people? You know, just nobody is. These conspiracies are just, you know, I don't buy them at all. I think it's more of a delusion, and we've seen examples in history of people being deluded about things, believing things, because there's a lot of wishful thinking. You know, if you ask people about green energy, you know, even the fact it's described as green energy, you know, you think, oh, that sounds so lovely, doesn't it? I mean, it's very much like if you ask a child to draw a picture of a house, they pretty much all draw you know, a box
detached
with a nice
house with a garden,
roof, and you'll have a little
and
tree
smoke coming out of the chimney.
yeah, a little wisp of smoke, and then you'll have the sun with sunbeams and maybe a couple of little clouds and some birds and flowers and little maybe wavy path. And like, but how many people actually live in a house that looks like that? You know, more people don't live in a house that looks like that than do. So it's a very naive and sort of childlike image. And people are like, oh, I want a green energy, it's so green, it's so lovely. No, to build a wind turbine, you need a huge amount of concrete and steel, which is very dirty. You've got to dig up half of South America to get it. You're going to rely on rare earth magnets from China. And, you know, that's obviously a topical concern right now, that China's dominating this market. But why does China dominate the market? Yes, to a certain extent because of anti-competitive practices, but also because it's a phenomenally dirty thing to do. And China's the only country in the world that is willing to tolerate that level of pollution that's caused in this industrial way. So other countries in the world won't allow it. It's not just that, you know, we for some reason haven't built up those supply chains. We could all produce rare earth magnets if we wanted to. But the reality is that these elements are very chemically similar. To separate them, you need a huge amount of energy and a lot of very harsh chemicals that creates massively toxic tailings that are difficult to deal with. And Western countries ban this level of polluting activity. And so then you're having to buy them from China because they care less about their local environment. They have lower population density, but also they don't really care because they suppress the population. So as long as they're not going too far with making the lives of normal people dirty, then so where it might lead to unrest, then they don't care. And so it's you know, it's just not the same. But then we have this image, all these lovely wind turbines, and they're all painted white and they look so pretty, and no, I mean, it's like the child's house. It is not really real.
And I think you're touching on there the moral questions around energy. And for me, one of the biggest moral questions is the impact on people's finances. So talk to us a little bit about the impact on investment in so-called green energy, and what that's doing to our economy in terms of moving away from traditional forms of electricity and generation and provision of gas, with that infrastructure which is getting older all the time and not being reinvested in. Those assets are not being maintained to the extent that they should be to generate years and years of future provision. How is this looking? What as you scan the horizon, Kathryn, how's this looking for the next 5 to 10 years for us in the UK?
It's looking horrific. We're spending billions and billions of pounds building. So solar in the UK has a capacity factor of 10%. So that basically means it only works 10% of the time. And wind is about 35%, so around a third of the time. So we're spending billions of pounds. We're digging up half of South America. We're poisoning large areas of China to build that stuff that only works a tenth or a third of the time. It's a massive waste of both capital and natural resources. I would actually ban wind. I actually think wind is immoral because it's so resource intensive that I just don't think there's a justification for it. Solar is less bad, and you can build solar behind the meter without subsidy. So if people want to put solar panels on their roofs and they're willing to pay for it, then whatever, that's up to them.
Yeah.
Nobody's really wanting to put wind turbines on their roofs. So if they want to do that with solar panels, they can crack on, as long as they don't buy them from China with forced labor. But I'm not really a big fan of banning things in general. But the wind thing is just awful. But then if we just didn't subsidize it, it would never be built. So that you wouldn't need to ban it. We'd just say we're not having any subsidies. And if you're going to build a wind farm, you've got to supply firm power. So then you have to be responsible for the intermittency. You have to deliver electricity all the time. And if it's not windy, that's your problem. Because at the moment, it's the consumer's problem. If it's not windy, the consumers have to pay for something else. Yes. So this is, a lot of the costs that wind and solar create are socialized to consumers immediately. And and there are all these hidden subsidies as well. If you want to drill a new gas field in the North Sea and it's not close to existing infrastructure, you're going to have to build a pipeline to bring that gas to shore. And you will have to pay for that as the gas company, the gas producer. But if you put a wind turbine in the middle of the North Sea, then the consumers pay for the wires to bring that electricity to the shore, right? So that's an immediate inherent subsidy. So you get a subsidy to build the wind turbine in the first place, and then someone else builds the infrastructure for you to connect it all up. So this is a huge difference to what you see in conventional energy. So all of these huge hidden subsidies and system costs that are created by renewables. So what we've actually done is we've spent a massive amount of money building stuff that only works a fraction of the time, which means we have to rely on conventional generation, but we haven't invested in that. So that's all getting old and going to fall over. So what does that mean? It means that when it's not windy and sunny, we won't have secure energy. So not only is our energy phenomenally expensive, we have the highest industrial electricity prices in the developed world and the fourth highest domestic electricity prices in the developed world. This has nothing to do with gas. Our gas prices are only the 15th highest. Clearly, if the gas was the driver, then our gas prices would need to be the highest as well. And so we've built this phenomenally expensive electricity system that is becoming less and less reliable. And we saw in Iberia in April a blackout that happened in very benign weather conditions, and 11 people lost their lives. So it's not just that we are creating economic harms, say, for households experiencing increasing levels of fuel poverty, businesses really struggling with energy costs. But if we start having blackouts, that will have both a risk to life and also a massive economic cost as well. The blackout that took out Heathrow Airport in March has been estimated to cost between 100 and 150 million pounds, and that was just one day. So so the costs of this and the cost of that risk is really significant, and I worry a great deal, and that's why I do a lot of the sort of advocacy work that I do, is to try and raise awareness of these things. And you mentioned before we started recording when I did my podcast on trigonometry. And a lot of people have said to me that they were quite frightened by the things I said on that podcast. This is my intention. I want to frighten people, not for the sake of it, but because if we don't have a fear of these risks and of these consequences, we're not going to act sufficiently quickly to avoid them. Like, why do people buy home insurance? It's because they're afraid their house might burn down. You have a fear of what would happen if your house caught fire and everything that you own burned, right? So this is why we buy home insurance, so that if that terrible thing happened, we wouldn't be destitute. And so we need to start thinking about our power system in the same way. We have these risks and we really need to do something about it. We're sitting there with our home not having insurance. And this is not a good place to be.
Now, as we move forward, time ticks on and these risks are simply getting bigger. They're not being mitigated in any way, shape or form. One of the other elements that, of course, I'm looking at all the time is the impact on the political spectrum and looking at to see how different political parties are addressing this. How do you feel that the political parties across Westminster are addressing or really understanding what's happening?
Okay, so I think there are two elements to this. There's one that's very specific to energy, and then there's a wider piece around governance and how government has happened in the last few decades. I think at the end of the Cold War, it really triggered a change in the way that we started to approach government in broader terms, that we'd gone from a situation where outcomes in terms of having prosperity, having a good military, having a strong economy, these things were the primary drivers of our behaviours. Now, obviously, we didn't always succeed in that, and we had some very negative U-turns, for example, in the 70s, where unions pushed us into some pretty difficult situations with, the 3-day week and blackouts and all the rest of it, rolling blackouts. And so I'm not going to say that it was always got right, but I think after the Cold War, there started to be this belief that we'd entered a new phase of humanity, where security actually was taken for granted and prosperity was taken for granted, because without security, you can't really have prosperity. So the security question had been essentially solved because the Cold War had ended. And now we were, so we could expect to have these sunlit uplands with lots of prosperity. And so we started to think about, we don't just want to do things, we want to do them nicely. We want to do them in a good way. And, that sounds lovely. So we're going to not discriminate against people, and we're going to not pollute, and we're going to, it starts off being very reasonable, right? I don't think we should discriminate against people, and I don't think we should be polluting. But then we end up having reports that claim that we can't build new nuclear unless the developers can guarantee that 50% of the jobs in the supply chain are being done by women. And my response to that is, you are absolutely insane lunatics to suggest that. The biggest priority is that we build nuclear power stations. I don't care if 0 women work in the nuclear sector, if that's the choice between getting power stations and not getting power stations. And actually, the reality is that we don't have 50% women in the nuclear sector, not because it's full of sexist dinosaurs, but just because enough women aren't going into the sector to begin with. Enough girls aren't studying science in schools, and that's not the fault of the energy sector. So these types of rules have got completely out of hand. You look at financial reports now, and they're like hundreds and hundreds of pages. It costs an absolute fortune to put them together. And for what? Do we really, really care enough about directors' remuneration to want to read 60 pages of detail about it? Do we really, really care about all the other nonsense that they're required to put in their annual reports? But all of this costs money. And one of the crazy things is that regulators are counted in productivity. They're not. That's not productive work. Regulators don't do productive work. They watch and monitor other people doing productive work. So if you took that activity out of productivity numbers, our productivity is terrible. It would be even worse if it were calculated properly. So we've on the one hand, we've created this huge mass of red tape that strangled prosperity and growth anyway. And we've given far too much power to outside bodies. And this is something that was really championed by Blair and Brown. They outsourced so much decision making from the government to arm's length bodies. So monetary policy, the Bank of England, which is probably the most significant example. But, Wes Streeting got frustrated with NHS England because he was trying to tell them not to hire so many D&I staff, and they were ignoring him. And what did he end up doing? Abolishing NHS England, because he couldn't make them do what he wanted. 2 weeks ago, we had in Birmingham the police saying, we can't guarantee the safety of Israeli football fans, so they can't come to the match. And the government was like, well, we don't agree with this, but we don't have operational control of the police. What kind of nonsense is this? We pay our taxes to the government. Provision of the police is one of the most important elements of what our taxes are supposed to go towards. And you're telling me that the people we pay our taxes to can't control the outcome in terms of what the police do and do not do, because they don't have operational control. So the government does not run the country. And until people understand that, you're not going to get change. And so I speak to Reform and I speak to the Conservatives. The other parties don't really engage. The SDP does on energy, but that's it. And a few independents do. And I say both to Conservatives and to Reform, you need to start talking about this. You both need to put this in your manifestos for the next election. You need to start educating the public that you can promise as much as you want, but you're not going to be able to deliver it because you are not going to run the country. And not only that, so Gordon Brown, just before the 2010 election, brought in a piece of legislation called the Constitutional Reform and Governance Act 2010. And that piece of legislation, among other things, made the civil service independent of ministers. So cabinet ministers cannot fire their permanent secretaries. So they cannot get rid of the people who run the civil service departments that they're supposedly in charge of. So when Wes Streeting wanted the NHS to stop hiring diversity managers, he did not have the levers to do that. And if the permanent secretary in charge of the Department for Health wants to hire 15 million diversity hires, there's nothing Wes Streeting can do about that. He cannot fire the permanent secretary. If the permanent secretary decides that everybody within the Department for Health is going to work 3 days a week on diversity, there's nothing Wes Streeting can do about that. He cannot fire them. If he says, right, today we're going to do prostate screening, that's a topical thing at the moment. A lot of people are calling for that to be more routinely offered. So let's say Wes Streeting decided that was a good idea. And if his permanent secretary disagreed, he can't force them to do it. He can't say, right, you're fired because you're not doing this thing I told you to do. Now, the Conservatives didn't really understand this until they left office, because when this law was only passed just before the 2010 election. So when they came in 2010, the corruption of the civil service hadn't really happened. Now, I think it was fairly understood that it was already a little bit left-wing, and that it was definitely to the left of the Conservative government. And there was a certain expectation that they wouldn't be, for example, that supportive of Brexit. But
of course, initially it was a coalition with the Lib Dems.
It was, yes, but it was still the civil service, I think, was generally considered to be left-wing. But now it's massively left-wing. You look at DEFRA and DESNES, they've gone out and hired activists from Greenpeace. So it's then no wonder that the officials are following a particular agenda. And when I've spoken to Claire Coutinho and her team, so when they were in government, if they needed information, they'd obviously go to their officials and say, like, we need this information. And then they'd get some information. When they left office, obviously they didn't have civil servants working for them anymore. So they had to start finding information for themselves. And it was a light bulb moment, because they understood that they'd been presented with very narrow and biased information, and that actually the real picture was quite different. So this is one of the reasons that so they'd kind of started realizing that something wasn't right in energy before the 24 election, and 2023, when Claire was appointed as Energy Secretary, that was supposed to be marking a change in direction. But it wasn't really till they left office that they understood the extent to which they'd been misled and not able to make good quality decisions because they didn't have good quality information. Now, lots of people have said to me, well, if you're going to be a minister, you should be able to find information for yourself, blah, blah. I think that's a really unrealistic thing to say. First of all, ministers have to do two jobs because they're still a constituency MP and they're a minister. And it's just not really humanly possible, I don't think, to day after day second guess the people that are supposed to be working for you and assume that they're giving you duff information and spend all your time trying to work around it. You would get accused of bullying left, right, and centre, and you would feel like you were bullying as well. I just think it's not reasonable to expect people to behave that way. I think the genie's out of the bottle on this now, and I think the only way to remedy it, because we're not going to be able to go back to independence with the civil service. Obviously, we've got to repeal the corporate governance, the Constitutional Reform and Governance Act. We've got to put ministers back in charge of their departments. They need to make permanent secretaries and the directors general have to be political appointees now. I know people have said, in the US, it's quite paralyzing because when the administration changes, you then have this big time lag where they have to confirm all the appointments. So I don't, I think it should be entirely within the authority of the ministers just to keep whoever's in place from the previous government until they've decided what they want to do. So, I mean, there's no reason to have a gap. But you by having that hiring or firing authority, then you can make your staff do what you want them to do. I mean, obviously you still have that. You can't tell them to do stuff that's illegal, but so if the energy secretary wants, which is something that Claire was trying to do, an analysis of the full system cost of each generation technology, then they have to go away and start working on it. They can't go, well, we don't really agree with this, or we don't think we're going to like the answer, so we're just not going to bother. Like, go and do the work, and if you don't do the work, I'm going to fire you. It's that simple, because that's how it should work, right? If you don't do the work your boss wants you to do, then you should lose your job. It shouldn't be optional.
Absolutely.
And if you don't believe in the job that your boss wants you to do, then you should leave. If you have any integrity, you should leave and get another job somewhere else. You shouldn't be trying to sabotage it. So I do think there's this important thing that, and I think even Labour gets this. We've even heard Keir Starmer say that the government doesn't run the country. They just haven't really shown very much energy and willingness to do something about it. They've created more quangos. They got rid of one and created loads of others. Like, do we really need a football regulator? I mean, all of this stuff, we need to slash regulation. We need to go back to principles-based regulation as well. Get rid of all these detailed rule books. And then pay regulators far more money. We've got to stop this obsession with, how many people get paid more than the Prime Minister. The Prime Minister doesn't get paid enough money anyway, but we need to pay people the right amount of money for the job they're doing. And of course,
if we had a smaller government, one of the problems is the size of the state. Often people argue with me and say, well, this person's incompetent. Well, I think most people, unless they were like Margaret Thatcher and only relied on 4 hours sleep a night, so therefore could work 20 hours a day. And frankly, Kathryn, you're sort of in her wake from what you said to me earlier about not getting much sleep. Well done you. But unless you can work 20 hours a day, for most people, it is impossible to do that job. And the reason is, unless you are Superman or Superwoman, most people would not be able to manage that size of a role because the state has become too big.
Yes.
So one of the issues we have here, as well as the sovereignty of democracy, not just Parliament, yes, of course, but they are representative of the will of the people. We also have to be thinking about, is the overall size of the state, as you say, with unelected representatives, unelected groups, quangos, specialist experts being involved, is this the way that we want our country to be run? Personally, I feel that it's a symptom of the state being far too big.
Yes, no, I completely agree. And when I say I think we need to pay regulators more money, because obviously we do still need some regulation. Like in the water sector, we can't just let water companies put any old rubbish in our pipes. So that you have to have pretty detailed regulations around water quality. And you're going to want to have rules around sewage treatment and what you do with sewage.
Yes.
Now, but I think we shouldn't have a price control. And I've had some pretty interesting discussions with senior people in Ofgem about this, because Ofgem's been criticised quite a lot recently. I think there's been a huge amount of discussion in political circles in the last few months because Ofgem's very big. It's much bigger than comparator regulators in other countries, and it has a really big budget. And then there's a question about, is it really delivering? Is it really delivering value? Now, I think it's hamstrung to a certain extent because its mandate is very confused and conflicting. But, I was trying to explain why I thought the price control for the regulated utilities. So here I'm talking about the gas pipeline businesses and the electricity network businesses. So these are monopolies. And our approach to regulating monopolies has been essentially to control how much money they're allowed to charge. And I think the problem in the water sector comes down to this price control, because Ofwat didn't really understand the implications of the price control. And then that allowed financial engineers to come along and do what they did. So basically, the price control means that you have a stable income stream that you can predict over the coming years, depending on how long your price control is. They're all, I think, about 5 years now. So in both water and energy. So you can predict, 5 years ahead, your income is going to be really predictable. So that leads to what we call a securitization. Now, imagine you're a football company, a football club, and you have 100,000 season ticket holders, and they're going to pay £100 each. And it's probably not the right number, but let's say, they were going to pay £100 each for their season ticket every year, increasing with inflation. You then know your income stream, or a certain chunk of your income stream, in a pretty reliable way going into the future. So what you can actually do is you can borrow against that. It's called securitization. So you will then say, okay, well, we expect to get £10 million, whatever it is, each year from selling season tickets, and this is a pretty stable income stream. And so you can issue a bond, a 5-year bond, which will give you £50 million up front, and then you repay that £50 million with the season ticket income that you get over the next 5 years. And this is a very standard financial instruments. Now, what Macquarie did was they bought Thames Water, and they did this to the whole business because their entire income was subject to this price control, made it very predictable. So they basically securitized the entire income stream of the business. It was called a whole business securitization. And because under the price control, which used pretty orthodox financial theory, debt was cheaper than equity, they said, right, we're going to issue this debt that will change our capital structure to lower our cost of capital, because debt is cheaper than equity. And then actually what we'll do, we'll reduce the cost of debt even further by buying back shares and cutting the amount of equity we have in the first place. So they didn't just increase the debt, they reduced the equity, and they paid a lot out in dividends as well.
Yes.
This was all completely legal, and it was all a consequence of the price control. And this hasn't happened in the same way in the energy sector. But I was saying to Ofgem,
what you're saying is that mechanism, which, as you say, is perfectly legal, actually brings its own risks, because what it's doing is the behaviour. It's effectively that this feedback loop of behaviour, the incentives we might call them. Yeah. You're being incentivized to borrow, as you say, because debt is cheaper than equity, and because you can securitize it
out of the business, and so, and also, so if you didn't have this, if you didn't have the price control at all, you wouldn't have had the incentive to issue this debt against the income streams. And if you had done it, because obviously when you issue the debt, you get a lump of cash. And what they did was then they gave most of that cash to the shareholders. The shareholders, the natural shareholders for these types of businesses are pension funds. They want long-term stable income streams to match their long-term liabilities. So if you hand a pension fund a big lump of cash, so they invest in you, they give you a lump of cash. If a year later you give them a lump of cash, they're going to be like, what am I supposed to do with this lump of cash? I just gave you a lump of cash a year ago because I wanted stable income for the next 20 years. I didn't want 1 year down the line you to give me a lump of cash. What's the point of that? I had a lump of cash to start with.
Yes, it was an investment.
It doesn't meet their needs. So if you didn't have that price control, then you would have had the owners of those water companies would have been the pension funds, whose natural needs were not to receive big lumps of cash, but to have long-term stable income streams. And so you would have not had that risk of the capital extraction. So I said to Ofgem, obviously the securitization risk is not as present within the energy sector because there's too much changing. So you don't have the stability element. But I said that rather than doing all of this complicated calculation for how much revenue they should be allowed to charge, and you're having to evaluate all these business plans, and it's all very complicated, why don't you just set standards around what you really care about? You care about the asset base. You care about not having blackouts. You care about people not dying either because of blackouts or because of equipment failure. So transformers exploding is really dangerous. People can die. So you care about safety in that context. And So you should set your rules to deliver those outcomes, and you should go and audit. Let's go and inspect, the transformers. Let's look at your maintenance policies and do some sampling. The way you would in a financial audit. In a financial audit, you're trying to work out what they're worth. An asset life audit is to make sure that they're not getting old and falling over. And then you restrict the ability of the regulated companies to take money out. So you will have, within each period that you're going to monitor, 5 years or whatever, you'll say, okay, you can't pay dividends until you've met these certain criteria. So no dividends, no bonuses until you've met these criteria. And if you don't spend enough on investment in your assets, so you'll build up cash then because you're charging consumers but you're not spending the money, then we will put in mechanisms for you to give that cash back to the consumers before we'll let you pay dividends if you're not meeting the standards that you need to meet with your assets. So really,
I think that's a very sensible approach. The only trade-off I would say with that is that it's who's deciding on the regulation. That's always the question mark, isn't it? Is who sets that regulatory framework? Right. Who decides on the regulation?
The government. And so right now, that's effectively what happens. So the regulators answer to Parliament, but Parliament doesn't really practically take that on unless there's a problem, and then the select committee will start doing inquiries and so on. But Parliament also sets the mandate for the regulators through legislation. So when you establish your regulators or you reform your regulators, you need to make sure their mandate is clear, so that this is a consequence of, so that the type of regulation that you want to have is a consequence of the mandate that you give them. And I think you need to take a risk-based approach to regulation rather than a rules-based approach. So you get rid of large numbers of your regulators who are just all about looking at rules and developing rules and trying to catch people out if they're breaking the rules. And they have to ask for huge amounts of information from the regulated companies so that they can monitor all of this. So then there's loads of people in the regulated companies they've got to hire that then just literally all day, every day respond to all of these information requests. And it's just a make work that is not productive.
Mm. And I think this is one of the learnings from the 2008 global financial crisis, wasn't it? That we weren't looking enough at risk.
We did wrong after 2008. We put in place rules after 2008 rather than reinforcing principles. And the problem is, so then our rules are all designed to prevent the 2008 crisis happening again. They're not anticipating the next crisis. So if we get rid of this detailed rules-based approach, go back to principles, then you can get rid of an awful lot of people out of your regulators. And that enables you to pay the people that you've got left a lot more money, because you want really smart people in those jobs. And you want to have teams within your regulators whose whole job it is to think about the different ways in which the bit that they regulate can go wrong. So I've said things to Ofgem around this. You look at the two good examples in the French nuclear sector. One was, and people go, oh, I know that. It was, one of them, in fact, is a massive scandal. And, people in Ofgem have said, oh, yeah, but that would be a huge scandal if it happened. I'm like, huge scandals happen. We've had multiple huge scandals in the banking sector. How often do you see the big accounting firms getting fined because they'd signed off some companies' accounts as a going concern, but within a year, the company's in financial difficulty because it turns out the finance director was embezzling money or there was some other fraud going on. So scandals happen. And so you as a regulator, you should be thinking about all the different ways that your market can break. And in the French nuclear sector, at about 2016, they discovered that for decades, the companies that were supplying the steel for their nuclear reactors had been falsifying the metallurgy data for that steel. And the steel that they'd actually delivered had more carbon in it than the paperwork said it did. And carbon makes steel brittle, which is not a desirable quality in a nuclear reactor pressure vessel. So then they had to take all of their reactors offline, obviously not all at the same time, to check the quality of the steel that was used in the pressure vessels, and discovered many of them had excess steel. And at Flamanville, the new one that they've just opened, they've actually got to replace the lid of the pressure vessel when it closes for its first refueling, because it's substandard steel. So this had been going on for decades. It started in the 1960s. So massive scandal, huge, right? I mean, EDF not doing its own independent metallurgy testing is really quite insane, but but also the French regulator not requiring it, the French regulator not thinking, well, how could this go wrong? Now roll forward a few years, they then discovered in two of their types of reactors, an age-related defect that manifest over time in these two types of reactors. And so again, they had to take them all offline to inspect them, do remedial work and all the rest of it. So we could have that in our power grid. We might have particular types of switchgear that fail in a particular way once they get to be 40 years old, for example. So these are the types of risks that I think the regulators need to be thinking through. What if somebody's been selling transformers that aren't up to scratch and they've been faking the paperwork? What if some of our switchgear is going to fail in a particular way when it gets old, and we built a lot of them in the 1970s, so when they get to X age they all start doing a particular thing? What happens if it's like a Bearings Bank style of scandal, where maybe your director of maintenance at National Grid is either corrupt or out of his depth, and he's not actually doing the maintenance work, he's just stuffing all the work orders in a desk drawer and hoping nobody notices? What happens if somebody in Ofgem is taking backhanders to look the other way? There's all of these things, which would be actual crimes. Some of them would just be accidents or misfortunes, or with the best will in the world, things break or go wrong. But that's not comforting to the people on the receiving end. So the regulators need to be thinking about that, looking out for it, and putting in place processes that would find it before it happens. And you don't do that with rules. You can only do that with principles. And the principles have to allow a level of flexibility that when an issue occurs to a regulator, they'll say, oh yeah, they've just had this thing in the French reactors where they had that age issue thing. Oh, I wonder what would happen if we had that in our switchgear on the power grid, or our transformers, or some of our power lines. And then they go in and think, well, okay, how would we identify that? What tests and checks would we need to do to find that? And then you go and do those checks and tests.
Exactly.
And you have to have principles set up. So the Financial Conduct Authority has 12 principles, which I think should apply in the energy sector, because one of those principles is you have to cooperate with your regulator. Well, fantastic principle, right? So then if your regulator suddenly thinks, oh yeah, with this risk we've just thought of, we need to investigate, then you can just go off and do it. You don't need a consultation. You can just do it because the principle is there that they have to cooperate with you. And and if you start getting out of hand, then they can apply for a judicial review or whatever. So there will be still checks and balances. But you don't need to jump through 1,000,001 hoops just for the regulator to start regulating something new or differently. And so we need to streamline that, and we need to get much more back to the fundamentals of what we're trying to achieve, rather than trying to nail down every step along the way, which doesn't work, and it just costs a lot of money.
Kathryn, I have learned such a lot listening to you tonight, as I always do. I learned a lot listening to you at the conference, and also on many podcasts that I've listened to you. And you, every time you share something or you speak about something, I'm really blown away by, first of all, your knowledge on so many different subject areas. You're clearly a polymath, but also in terms of energy policy and energy security. So your voice is incredibly important to us in the UK. And thank you very, very much indeed for being here this evening. I think anyone who's listening to this podcast, whether they are part of Reform or not, doesn't matter. But I know they will have learned something absolutely tremendous tonight. And I think what we at Reform have to do is to listen to people like you who really understand and see what's going on across a whole broad range of issues that affects energy, whether it's regulation, whether it's the energy grid, whether it's our relationship with external energy providers. We haven't even talked about interconnectors and the relationship that we have with them and how we utilize those forms of transmission in energy. We could talk for another 2 hours. But at some point, you probably have to get away, as do I. But I have to say, it's been absolutely fantastic listening to you this evening, and thank you so much for your time. And I really look forward to keeping you, as part of one of our guests, and maybe in another 6 months or a year's time, we can revisit this conversation. I'm sure there'll be more news that we can speculate on and talk about. Some of the other, as you've mentioned, some of those big industry issues that cropped up in 2025. We've got other things to talk about moving forward. But for now, I'd like to wrap up and say a very big thank you to you.
My pleasure. Thank you.